So I'd like to suggest that we might want to think about the e-portfolio as one digital means for creating and using evidence of knowledgeability in order to access knowledge pathways. So there's our ontology of knowledge and learning. Let's move on to ethics. And in Etienne and Bev's work, they talk about expressibility of knowledgeability. And they mean by that, in a given context, how much of that experience, how much of that identity that you've developed through your journey, through the multiple communities, personal, professional, civic, that you're engaged with, can you bring to bear in the conversations that represent your expertise and make decisions in a particular context? And they suggest that increasing expressibility both honors the identity of the people involved and increases the effectiveness of the generation of knowledge within any particular or intellectual community. So I'd like to suggest that two ideals, educational ideals that I talk about in the book that I mentioned at the beginning, authenticity and integrity, may be important to thinking about what we ought to be able to express. So authenticity is a concept that goes back at least to Rousseau in Western culture, and that's the idea that there's an imperative to find truth through examining what's really unique about yourself. If you look deep inside, you're going to find this distinctive character that's you, and that you ought to follow that, and you ought to make decisions on the basis of who you really are. And that one way you express that is by being creative, by following your own path, right? And the consequence of valuing this is that choice becomes really important. We need to allow people to follow their own paths, so we need to maximize the choices that they have. So here's an example of a front page of a portfolio of a student I had when I taught at George Mason University, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. In the United States. This student, Stephanie was her name, she writes in the introduction to this portfolio, you know, I've moved across several different programs of study in the university, but I don't want any of these things to define me. I am my own person. I set my own path. I define who I am, right? I'm not reducible to a future chemist or what have you. So she's really expressing that goal of, I am unique. I don't fit into boxes. You can't, dividuation doesn't work on me. I'm going to define myself in opposition, in many cases, to these courses of study, professional categories that are defined by the university and other kinds of authoritative institutions. But if you look further into the study of authenticity in philosophy, other philosophers argue that, and this is Charles Guignon, who's done a really nice synthesis of this work, that authenticity really is fundamentally a social thing. For one thing, how do you know which differences really matter, right? I perhaps have 1,000 more hairs on my head than Olga does. Is that part of my core essence and who I truly am? Well, no, I don't think it matters, but the only way I know that it doesn't matter is because I have a social horizon of intelligibility. There's a social context that tells me certain differences are important and certain differences aren't. So really the idea that authenticity can be totally divorced from social context does not work. So really we need to redefine authenticity, acknowledging that social nature. So Guignon says becoming an authentic individual is not a matter of recoiling from society in order to find or express an inner self. What it involves is the ability to be a reflective individual who discerns what is genuinely worth pursuing within the social context in which he or she is situated. Right? So if we return to my student, in her portfolio, you'll see that she's referring to the Organic Garden Association she's involved in and her work on that, her work in the environmental media team, her work in all of these social configurations, organizations that connect her interests to a larger context and other people, and larger social discourses about what's valuable in society. So although she's defining her own path, she's doing it in conversation with multiple communities of others that are articulating what's important and finding her path. So that's a different way of thinking about authenticity. So authenticity is important, but shouldn't be seen as choice of being able to isolate yourself from social context, but choice of how you move through social contexts that are available to you. A second ideal I want to talk about is the ideal of integrity, and I wanted to pick up on Samuel's journey metaphor and discussion of Ulysses. So one way of thinking about who we are is, that we are the journey, right? That over time we aggregate lots of experiences, knowledge, and things, and those traces that list of things that of experiences we have define who we are. But another way of thinking about it is that we have an active role in deciding which of those traces are meaningful, which are less meaningful, how the pieces fit together, where the meaning is in the relationships, to tell a story, in other words, based on that raw material that we've gathered over the course of our journey. So I would say that I think Ulysses is much more the character in the Odyssey than he is the historical figure who traveled a certain path through the world, right? That in terms of our cultural understanding of Ulysses, it's much more defined by Homer's telling of that story, his deciding which parts of that journey were important, which parts weren't, how they fit together, how they had messages that go beyond just the historical chronicle of events, and that's really what the ideal of integrity is how do we talk about how the pieces fit together and express it as a coherent whole that actually means something. So one way that I have in past work talked about that distinction is distinguishing between what I call a network self and a symphonic self. So in trying to curate, to cultivate a network self, you're making intentional connections. You're gathering things over time, putting them together, right? Taking ownership of your traces as you move through the world and through the web. But the symphonic self goes further and says, here's how these things fit together. Here's what they mean. Here's the person, the whole coherent person I want to present of myself based on all of this raw material. And there are a variety of different contrasts you can make between these two ways of thinking about the self. And I think they're both important. There's particular digital literacy, digital citizenships, or just plain citizenship skills associated with both. But I see in a lot of the discourse around the internet a real focus on the network and a lack of attention to the symphonic piece. And so I don't think that your life is just a list of things that have happened. It's just an activity feed, right? It needs to be a story. It needs to be an argument about who you are and how it means and how it adds up to something significant. And that's what taking ownership of your symphonic self means. So as an example, I'd like to talk about Samantha Slade, and this is a portfolio that she created. She's a Canadian. She lives in Montreal, and she, when she was about 40, was about to turn 40, she had been in a very comfortable government job doing educational technical assistance for about a decade. They'd enjoyed that work, but had a passion to do more, to go in another direction. And so she wanted to figure out, what is that direction? How do all of the different things that I'm involved in and care about, my commitments, my values, my activities, what I know, what I want to know, how do they add up to? In her words, how do I find a thread through my life? And so she used a portfolio to do that. So she included information not just about her competencies, but her values, the resources she has, her sense of herself as a person, what she's able to do. And what's very interesting about this particular portfolio is that she has videos and pictures and other kinds of media throughout it that situate. So this is a video of her in her home. There's another video of her in her of Montreal. So making the link between her professional trajectory and the other kinds of contexts and communities in which she lives. So integrity, as I talk about it, is a concept that both has a lifelong and a life-wide component. So it's lifelong in the sense that it's about creating a sense of consistency and coherence over time, telling your life story in a way that the pieces braid together into something that makes sense. But also it's life-wide in the sense that we all have different hats on at different points in our lives. We're members of family. If we're immigrants to a country, we may have ties to our home country and culture as well as to our adopted country as a culture. We have professional identities, but we also have identities as members of a civic community, varied commitments that can connect and conflict. And we need to be able to talk about those relationships. And narrative, telling stories, is a particularly powerful means for making those connections and articulating those distinctions. And the need for this really has increased over probably since World War II, but arguably perhaps even since the early parts of the century, in that, and this is I'm drawing here on the work of Robert Keegan, who's at the Harvard School of Education, from a really terrific book called In Over Their Heads, or In Over Our Heads, rather, where he suggests that there are increasingly complex mental demands that we have as individuals in daily life. Because in the past, very strong cultural traditions, very authoritative institutions have made a lot of distinctions for us that now we must make ourselves. What is the boundary between home and work, for example? Obviously, technology accelerates the permeability of this boundary. You know, if I have a cell phone where someone can send me email anywhere, then, you know, when do I decide to turn that off and say it's time to pay attention to my kids, you know, instead of answer work emails? That's a personal decision I have to make. There's not some external authority deciding that for me. So that's just an example of one area of life. But in a lot of areas of life, boundaries that were once set externally, we have to figure out for ourselves. And so that means having some critical distance between our values, our relationships, and experiences. Not just being constituted by them, but having ownership of them and being able to examine them at some remove and then to make changes to shape the course of them. So that requires really thinking about yourself, your experiences, your values, your commitments as a system that you can describe and manipulate. And that's a new kind of skill and a very cognitively challenging one that traditionally education has not had to prepare us for and empirically doesn't prepare us for very well. So we'll move now to epistemology, right? We've talked about the nature of knowledge. We've talked about what ethically we need to be able to represent about ourselves and our expertise in the context of that nature of knowledge. Then we move to the next question, which is, how do we make good decisions in light of all of that, right? We do have to make distinctions between, to decide who gets to enter a university, to graduate, who becomes a certified member of a profession, who is going to be the leader of our city or town. So we have to make decisions based on evidence. But is there a way that we can take this broader kind of evidence that I've been speaking about and bring that to bear? In creating these narratives, we really have now a broader set of kind of raw materials to draw on because we have all of these different kinds of traces. So we have e-portfolios, which are a synthesis, but we also find things like digital badges are a new kind of representation of knowledge, skills, and abilities that are gaining traction. We have a lot of emerging work around learning analytics, looking at the very fine-grained traces we look and mathematics to try in the ways that we interact. So we can take all of those pieces and make them part of our narrative. And they're exciting because they allow to relate our individual stories, our individual experiences to collective experiences in new ways. So we can move beyond saying being a plumbing to let's look at all of the plumbers and let's see that the ones good, what are they learning, what are they engaged in, and have about what expertise looks like that then can become the basis of stories that people tell in communities about what they know and can do. And we have tools like social learning network analysis that provide new methodologies for looking at those relationships. We have research like the research on epistemic network analysis that's going on at the University of Wisconsin at Madison that's looking at particular emerging professions and saying, you know, what are the skills and knowledge that characterize that field? Yes, but also what are the values, the identity, and the epistemology, the way of thinking about what counts as knowledge and how you gain it that are important in that field, and recognizing that if you're going to enter a particular field, you need to be enculturated not just in the skills and knowledge, but in all of this. So we have some empirical ways to bring up, to find some of these emerging patterns, but ultimately I think those have inchoate meaning, and I'm taking that term from John Dewey's work in the early 20th century American philosopher in The Public and His Problems, where he suggests there are relationships, there are connections that are out there to be found, but they don't yet have meaning, they don't yet have reality until we have conversations about them and agree that they're meaningful and consciously make connections, consciously incorporate them into our stories, into our identities. And I think that's particularly important because there are lots of powerful organizational entities, governments, corporations that are looking at those patterns and making judgments about us. So there was a story that went around a couple of years ago in the United States where a father of a teenage girl was looking through the mail, and she found an advertisement sent to that teenage girl, from the Target Corporation, advertising products for young babies. Right? And that was really confusing because, it was her 17-year-old daughter and she wasn't married, and so why would she have any interest in projects for young babies? Well, it turned out when the father had a conversation with that daughter, she was pregnant. Right? So Target was able to find out by the data about her consumer habits, was able to figure something out that her own father didn't know. Right, that she was going to be a mother. That is both fascinating and scary, right? So, this big data, these traces of the web, people are mining them. People are making decisions about every day. We need to decide what the boundaries are and what our role is in those decisions get made. We probably can't control very easily what big corporations like Target are doing. But a place that we can start in terms of corporate behavior is our educational institutions. We do have control as students, and particularly as faculty member and staff of educational institutions, about how we're governed, about decisions. So one way to do that is to start by doing assessment differently. And that may mean thinking about what constitutes a valid assessment differently. Validity simply means, are we making judgments that are right? Traditionally, that's been thought of in a very narrow way in educational measurement. But we can really expand that out and say that we need to look at multiple sources of evidence over different types of scale. We need to look at what are the actual consequences of those decisions, right? All of these things figure into the validity, not just does it pass certain kind of statistical tests. And ultimately, every assessment has behind it a validity theory, and every validity theory is a representation of an epistemology, a philosophical stance on the nature and justification of knowledge claims. And this comes from work by Elizabeth Moss and her colleagues at the University of Michigan. So can we shift the epistemology that underlies assessment from a very narrow epistemology of educational measurement, which is about certain kinds of very narrow kind of statistical tests, to an epistemology that acknowledges the broader kinds of evidence that I've been. One way to do that is to say, let's talk about a deliberative form of assessment, a form of assessment that moves on from focusing on the specific characteristics of evidence. What test items do we have? What particular papers are we going to look at? To how do we make decisions? What are the norms of those conversations about whatever evidence that we bring to bear on our decisions? So this suggests a form of assessment that has a couple of underlying assumptions. One is learning is complex, and it's situated in a complex social environment, and I've been arguing that for some time now. Also that judgments are embodied in the expertise of people situated in those environments, that you can't simply have a purely objective stance that's divorced from those social contexts, and that students themselves, or learners themselves in a lifelong learning concept, are what my colleague Kathy Yancey calls authoritative informants on their own learning. That there's some things about your own experience that are important to understanding your learning that you have to tell me. There's no other way to get that information. And that we ought to be making decisions based on this variety of sources of evidence. So I propose that we can use portfolios as a mediator, as the raw material, as a conversation piece for these collective deliberative conversations about how we make decisions, using principles from deliberative democracy theory. And deliberative democracy theory is both a set of norms for how we make decisions, and it's a way of legitimating those decisions. There is a sense, at least in the United States, and perhaps here as well, that if we have broad, inclusive, logical discussions about what we're going to do, then the resulting decisions have greater legitimacy than things that are made by fiat by somebody in authority without the involvement of the people that are affected. So there are some core principles from deliberation, such as publicity, inclusiveness, reasonableness, provisionality. These come particularly from the work of Amy Gutman and Daniel Thompson, with a little bit of Irish Young mixed in, that we could use to shape our system. And I won't talk about those at length, just to say that thinking about those principles is important. And if we're going to move to a deliberative system, then competencies or outcomes or abilities, there are different terms for these things, have a really different role. So traditionally we think of competencies as we're going to predefine a set of outcomes. You must know this, be able to do that, believe this, and you can check the list and you provide evidence that you match those things. In a deliberative system, I'd like to suggest that what competencies can do is capture the standards of all stakeholders, that all stakeholders value in practice, and examine their alignment. So we can say we care about something like leadership, but what does it mean to different people? And what is the evidence that supports the different perspectives? And how do we put those into conversation to come to some kind of collective understanding rather than the collective understanding being the starting point? It becomes the final product. So in educational settings, in a standardized model of using competencies, competencies articulate expectations to students, whereas in a deliberative model, it's a means for being mutually accountable to the connection between individual perspectives, values, that individual integrity that can be created in a portfolio, and the organizational process of making decisions and learning together. So competencies focus is what the sociologist of science Susan Lee Starr termed boundary objects. And she says that boundary objects are objects that are both plastic enough to adapt to local needs and constraints of the several parties employing them, yet robust enough to maintain a common identity across sites. Right? So in closing, let me tell you a story, again from my time at George Mason University, that'll make this process a lot more concrete. So at George Mason, we we required students as a graduation requirement to create a portfolio that represented their entire undergraduate learning experience with a focus on their particular area of emphasis. And it was organized around a set of 12 what we called competencies that ran throughout the curriculum in the unit in which I taught, which was called New Century College. So this is the first page of a portfolio by a young man whose name was Sean Moore, and he was focused on community studies. He was a very spiritual, reflective, I don't know how this translates, we'd call him sort of crunchy granola guy, kind of a hippie, and he really had this perspective of going out and exploring the world and defining himself very differently from everyone else, but he was interested in engaging with different spiritual communities. And one of the competencies in this program was the communications competency. And so in his section of his portfolio on communications, he said, I came into my undergraduate education thinking that communication was about being able to clearly convey information and to convince people of stuff, right? And that was it. So, I took a speech class, and here's some PowerPoints for my speech test showing that I'm good at that, right? But then, when I had these other experiences, when I went and lived on an ashram in Quebec, and experienced a particular spiritual community, traveled through India, I began to see other aspects of communication that was important. He got very interested in the work of Thich Nhat Hanh, the monk, and he really talks about the importance of silence and presence as a kind of communication, its importance in healing. That sometimes it's not about conveying information, it's about being there together. That's what's really important. So he suggested, well, maybe that's an important part of communication that we in New Century College ought to be paying attention to. Here's another portfolio, really different personality. This guy named is Wayne Lin. He is a get-it-done kind of, hard-charging guy. You can see even visually, very different personality. But interestingly, there's some similar patterns that emerged in his communications essay. In his essay on communications, he talked, yes, about the conventional stuff about being persuasive and conveying content, but he also talked about his experience running a computer lab on campus. And part of his job in the computer lab was to help people do things, to edit photos in Photoshop or what have you. And given his personality, his first impulse was to go in and just do it for him. Here, let me fix it. You need to crop that photo, I can do it in 2 seconds. But he realized they don't learn anything from that. So the next was, well, let me write down step-by-step instructions for you, and that will be good, and that'll be good enough. He realized that was fine as long as people would only encounter exactly that same situation in the future. But what he found was most important, and he called this having fits of patience, was to sit down with them and say, you know, you try it. You try to figure it out. I'll be here if you need me, right? But I'm just going to sit back and watch. So here's this idea of kind of silence and presence being important to communication, totally different context, different individual, right? And then we had at New Century College times where we got together. We brought the faculty, we brought students, we brought people from around the university to talk about those competencies. What do they mean? What should we value about them? And in those conversations, Wayne and Sean were able to find, you know, we have a connection. So maybe the curriculum around communications at the university ought to be paying attention to silence and presence. Now, maybe not. That's part of a deliberative process. But we would never have seen that as faculty members making that decision unless we had both these representations in portfolios and these deliberative contexts to collectively make decisions. So that's it for me. I was skipping the politics part. I just want to quickly well, anyway, you can see it. Buy the book. There's some other books that may be interesting if you're interested in this work. But thanks very much.
Thank you very much.